computer. Okay, this is the February 2025 meeting of the 1904 World's Fair Society, and I'd like to look back to Friday, February 19th, 1904, 121 years ago today. The fair's opening was about 10 weeks away, and there was an incredible amount of work remaining to be completed, but they were working hard, double shifts. About 250 members on this day of native Filipino tribesmen and women arrived in Seattle on their way to the fair. They included 17 Bontoc Igorots, 17 Suyak Igorots, 88 Carlingas, 33 Negritos, and 90 Visayans. Today, Wydown Middle School stands on the site of the Igorot village. The old football team was known as the Igorots from 1937 to 1974. They did change their name, though. It's interesting to note that of the 1,100 people from the Philippines that came to put on display their culture and artifacts from the Philippines, only about 250 of them were from, quote, the native villages. The rest of the Filipinos were managers and museum people that were showing their culture and technologies. President Roosevelt accepted an invitation to be the honorary president of the Olympic Games, the third Olympic Games. James Sullivan, the chief of the Department of Physical Culture, said that President Roosevelt was the greatest advocate of physical training and that his participation would mean much to the Games. Finally, a contract was awarded with 10 weeks to go to a New York company to build an auxiliary water filtration system for the Cascades. President Francis and the fair management feared that the Cascades would be fouled with muddy Mississippi water. And I think we've heard the expression from Mark Twain about many different rivers, that it was too thick to drink and too thin to plow. The firm planned to use 4 tanks filled with iron salt for coagulation, handling 500,000 gallons daily. The system was never used. Why, you might ask? Because John Wixford, a chemist in the St. Louis Water Department, solved that problem and figured out how to
Yes, I am.
clear the water. And he did that with about 5 weeks before the fair opened, and it was basically a this better work type thing, and it worked. And it's been noted that the same water was used in a lot of fish tanks, and the fish didn't like it too much. There was too much chemicals, and so they tried a little less and a little less, and eventually got it right to where about the 3rd or 4th shipment of fish on exhibit survived. So I'd like to introduce our presenter tonight, Dave Walsh. Dave is a full-time lecturer at Washington University's American Culture Studies program. While his research focuses on technology mainly since 1950, he teaches classes on many varied topics that highlight the tremendous technological and scientific advances of the 20th century with their impact on culture and society. Dave is also a vocal proponent of digital privacy rights and digital security education. Dave was one of the handful of people that were selected to write a chapter in the History Museum's new book about the World's Fair, The Wonder and Complexity, which is a very interesting book showing a lot of different perspectives about the fair for sale in the History Museum. I went to a presentation that he did. It was somewhat based on the essay that he wrote in there. And I went, wow, we need to learn more about this. And he is impaneled, been there at the History Museum twice, I think, Dave, either hosting a panel or being a panelist. And one of the very more interesting things, and if you think the World's Fair highlighted a lot of new technology, Dave is here to tell us about some of them. So I give you Dave Walsh.
Thank you, everyone, for the invite, and hello, everyone online in the room. Thank you for having me here. I want to thank in particular Mike for being patient with me as a human being and my schedule, because this has taken too many years of your life to be able to line this up to be here. So what I'm going to do all right, I'm a professional nerd. That needs to be out there first and foremost. I do one of the nerdier things you're going to find in academic work, and that is the history of technology. My particular specialty comes out of World War II in the computing industry. I'll explain a little bit about that in a minute. But so many of my courses, because I'm in St. Louis, reach all the way back to the kind of emergence of industrial St. Louis in the 19th century, and in particular, that this was an important city for automobile innovation before the Great Consolidation. And that's plenty to talk about at another time. So real quick, here's how I'm going to go through and professionally bore you. We'll do a little bit about me, and then a little bit of concept building that sets up what I wrote in the book, which is different than everything else in the book, and what I am going to share tonight. And I'm assuming that this essay is at least somewhat familiar, so I'm not actually going to cover all of it. I'm going to give you a summary of it, and from there, going to expand it a little bit more, talking about a couple other exhibits and a little bit of cultural context along the way. All right, well, I'll do the awkward lean in. Yeah. And I think I'm off camera now. But just
Cover your camera.
Whoop. Can you get shit? Yep. All right, how about now? Can you hear me online? Perfect. All right, awesome. This will be fun. I'll feel like I'm at a concert. We're getting one. All right. So a bit about me. I am a historian of technology. So as a historian, I am invested in putting things in the long view of what came before, and as a cultural historian, what comes next. There we go. And I work specifically inside of technology studies around something called the technologic imagination, which is a little marble-barbly, but essentially it's about how people in certain places and certain times integrate something we call technology into their everyday practice. And the key term here is integrate, not actually technology. It's the integration feature that I find most interesting, because it implies a lot of cognitive work. That is, people have to figure out how to imagine what an object is, what it does, what it's for, how to use it, what it means, what, if anything, comes next. And these are culturally dependent processes that inform these answers, but also how the answers are expressed. That is to say, people have to learn about the things around them, everything from chairs to laptops to Zoom, and they learn about them being cultural actors with operating in a whole rich environments of media and other technologies, and then they find ways to talk about them. Said differently, people make things to talk about, and to think about, to talk about, and debate made things. And it's true for makers, investors, your capital clientele, as well as for users. We all participate in this, and the fun thing about doing the history of such things, and what brings me to the World's Fair, is to be able to look back and see how all of these dynamics get shared into this particular moment. And while I don't specialize initially into my role as a scholar, and I'm off camera, sorry about that, everyone online. I wander entirely too much because I've had too much caffeine in the fair. Anyway, I come to the World's Fair because there's something really interesting that happens in this moment in 1904. And that's what I'm going to hope to highlight here. And that is the history of what was, what comes before, really gets consolidated in expression in St. Louis. That St. Louis then kind of expands its particular civic and citizen identity with these larger narratives. And then two, and this is what I think is more interesting about what I do, it actually launches a whole set of imaginations into the future about what the future is going to look like. I'll get into more on that later. Let's focus, Mike. Move the camera up to his computer. Oh, there we go.
This is your Zoom mic.
It will depend on Mike to do that.
It's fine.
Yeah, can you make that bigger there so they can all see? Especially when you get to the pictures, it'll be a little bit richer.
Well, that's the camera and microphone for Zoom.
Okay.
That's the microphone for the group.
Right. We're talking about this here, making that larger. Give us one sec. We're working on technical issues.
Doug, do you recall how to hide the,
Try the view option. Top right.
There you go. Right. So yes, we're going to talk about imagination, and that is for the World's Fair. How does it imagine the past? And how is it setting up the imagination of the future? And there's nothing like setting the standard for how to imagine things than a giant, massive piece of technology that is for some strange reason elevated off the ground and that spins 360 degrees. It is one of my favorite objects in this whole fair. Sorry?
This mic too. For people
Oh,
online.
okay. Sorry. Wow. All right. So this is one of my favorite objects, and I'm going to get into it a little bit later, why that should be. But I'm going to start the kind of the recap of the essay with where I start in the essay, and that's a fellow named Murat Halstead, which everyone is familiar with, of course. He is a very popular writer, former judge, had a number of government positions, and he is a rather prolific profiler, biographer of people coming out of the 1890s, and he was cast to write a kind of an authoritative companion to the World's Fair, not the guide, not the official guidebook that is compiled by Lowenstein and kind of given the stamp of approval from the LPE, but instead he's paid by the LPE to come up with the companion guide to visitors on the ground. And the Library of Congress registers this for copyright in September of 1904, though it was actually published and available a couple of months earlier. And it's 500 pages long. It's huge. And it's about US history, St. Louis history, and given his interest in hyperbolic statements, it's an incredible marketing document that everything is awesome and that everyone needs to see everything and spend your money on all the exhibits. So I'm actually going to borrow from his, So, okay, so the essay starts with a quotation from Halstead that's different than this one, but I like this one in this moment because it's exactly the third page into his book. This is his preface, and I'm gonna try and make this a little bit easier. The most important part here is that the summer school at St. Louis, that is the World's Fair, will have for pupils the youth of the land, and all the children will remember the beauty of the story of the country. Indeed, it will instruct all our countrymen, men, women, and children, that the teaching of the purchase of Louisiana is the extension and aggrandizement of our national union. That is to live and grow forever, brighter and brighter in all the schools and festivals, that all Americans may know themselves, defend the dignity of the nation, and with the years add to the affluency and keeping the honor that is the soul of the people. And this is the program of the fair in kind of flowery language that expands on so many moments that David Francis, especially when he's traveling overseas, seeking other nations to send staff to build and participate in the fair on the grounds, this is Halstead really getting to the point of it, that the key thing we're doing here as a fair, like all fairs before, at least before, is that we're here to teach something.
Came up here.
And we're going to, part of what we teach is about identity. It's about citizenship. It's about how the person and the nation reflect one another, and then how you make for a better, brighter future, as he says. And this education element begins about a quarter of the way through his book with his own commissioned map of the world. And I highlight this in the essay, that this map is unremarkable in every single way, except for one little detail, that they have positioned St. Louis nearly exactly in the middle between the Pacific Rim on the left and the middle part of the European nations on the right. This is part of his argument that St. Louis, because of this fair, is now the center of the world. It's a way of communicating that St. Louis, which, if everyone remembers St. Louis, not aside of being in competition with Chicago, it's not a world maker city. And here comes Halstead coming to a fair that is many tens of millions of dollars of investment, bringing in millions of people and saying, wait a minute, what's happening here literally puts this city on the map and puts it in connection, importantly, with a long history of the Enlightenment and with principles coming out of Europe and projecting those to civilizations elsewhere. And because education is at the center of teaching people who they are, where they come from, and importantly, where it's going, the fair itself had more than one pedagogical installation. This is the Palace of Education and Social Economy, dedicated to education, to teaching. This is the model St. Louis classroom that's inside that particular palace. And I believe my next picture is a close-up of that. So we have here, ringed along the ceiling, the stories of founding and the principal people, principal battles. And I particularly love the really nice handwriting on the chalkboard in the background, which I'm not capable of in the classroom, ask any of the students. The noblest lesson learned in life is self-control. That's a really interesting way of thinking about how we do education, and indeed that sense of self-control inside the fair. There's an element of that too. There's also the model school. So if you come into the fair through the principal entrance, which is Lindell to the east, and you take a left as soon as you get in, you enter into the model street. It was supposed to be the model city, but they didn't have funding really to kind of build it out to their wildest dreams. So it's a stretch of the walkway that features a number of things, including the model school. And we also have, of course, infamously, the model Indian school, which is a training recenter. It's about providing an educational experience to indigenous, to the natives, that makes them more American. And this is featured over in the ethnographic side of the fair, which is to the west, over by the fish and wildlife building. So I'm going to take you back real quick. I can't see my notes, so I may not get this year right, but I believe this is 1862. This is a Currier and Ives print and appeared in hundreds of publications. It's an illustration that is, I can't see my notes, but as I recall, westward expansion is the general title, and the subtitle is about settling the frontier. And the reason I bring this picture up is that notice to the lower center part of the screen, which I don't know if you can see here in the room, but you have a bunch of children in front of a building that's called the school. It's the public school. And keep in mind, for context, Currier and Ives, hello there. Right where the kids are. There you go. Thank you, Mike. Currier and Ives never traveled west. This is an impressionistic, they never went to this place. This is an impression. It's operating inside of a particular sort of American landscape tradition. And I'm going to come back to this picture later, but it is important to note that they put this school literally front and center equivalent to the machinery just to the right, to the railroad and its infrastructure. We'll come back to that. So my point here is that the idea of the importance of education that allows you to do what the gentleman here on the lower left, they're clear cutting the land to expand the colony and to kind of create pathways for settlers to move west. Settlers have to know how to do a lot of things all on their own because they're on their own. Education is essential for kind of taming the continent and for, importantly, for innovating new things and to be connected to larger social order. It's also important in this time, this is an 1880 cover for the magazine Scientific American. And what's important here is that this too is participating in the long argument of making a citizen. And the citizen of the United States in the 19th century, if you're an American, you're a particular kind of an American. You are a scientific one. That means you participate in rationality, empiricism, innovation, essentially applied, as it says here, arts and sciences. If we zoom in, we see here in the background a very similar neoclassical building, which constitutes the archive of knowledge,
It's right there.
advanced
I'm back.
Advanced knowledge keeping and knowledge sharing, which is similar to the Palace of Education, not exactly in design, but the idea of this statutory place that is the center of a thriving citizenry and economy is set in front with the muse of knowledge, which is borrowed from Greek traditions. And this muse will appear in a number of different ways throughout the 19th century. But importantly, her companion is a settler. It's a frontiersman. It's someone who knows how to work metal and to make things. It's a little hard to see here, but on the right of our two companions, you have smokestacks, which indicate industry, but right in front of that are a series of massive made things made out of metal that are highly mathematic and engineering, and their origin points, these are gears and other things that make the nation move. So together, we have a series of imprints about education and their importance, and the fair knows well enough that that's what they're participating in. It's in the air. And importantly, the fair is about innovation and applied science to kind of project forward who and what we could be. And so in the essay, I wrote about a ton of stuff, and I gave them about 27,000 too many words. And they asked, try again, narrow this down. So I wrote principally about wireless communication to keep up with this idea of innovation, which is important. And so here we have three pictures that I use in larger works when I teach, when I speak elsewhere. We have the tower, the DeGraff wireless tower on the left, and then on the upper right, which I'll give you a close-up in a moment, that is the installation, the DeGraff installation in the Palace of Electricity, and beneath that is one of a number of wheeled wireless machines that were stationed throughout the eastern part of the fairgrounds. So this tower is near the principal entrance, and it does not show up in most maps of the fair. It's really interesting. So right there you have, as you can see behind it, the rail station that services Lindell Boulevard. And on it is a very common and popular observation deck. There are at least 8 or 9 dozen photographs I've found of people who used that platform to look out across the vista of the fair. It was very important for the fair designers, the landscape architects, and the building architects to create different heights so that people could see the fair down below beneath the size of the building, to kind of be impressed by that size, but also to stand above it and to be able to look out and see the full landscape. This particular tower is so tall that it was seen and visible from everywhere in the palace east end, and I found photographic evidence that reaches roughly to the WashU's campus to be able to see it in the distance, and that'll be important in a few minutes. Here we are inside the Palace of Electricity,
You can't.
and what you have are three structures that reach to the heightened ceiling of the palace. Remember, these things are, 10,000 feet tall on the inside, but these three together are wired at the top to be an antenna. It's a broadcast space. It can also receive. And down below, they have the telegraph receiving and transmitting station. This is de Graaf himself doing a ceremonial message send. We'll come back to, yeah. And so inside the palace, excuse me, it's a demonstration of wireless technology. And I highlight in the essay that what's interesting here, first of all, is that the World's Fair itself was fully integrated with regular telephonic wires. That is, it's a wired campus. Administrative managers can reach and call out to every building and every exhibit through phones. And several companies, including AT&T and Kinlock locally, provided external circuits and lines so that people could call throughout the city. This is important for journalists, and then to the region. And from that region, they can connect with large switching nodes that allowed for long distance telephonic communication. That is to say, by 1904, the telephone, though not in every home, was a fully realized, naturalized technology. It was done. Aside from getting a little bit more efficient, and certainly more mechanical as it will through the 20th century, it's finished. What's interesting is that we're testing a relatively brand new technology at the fair. Wireless has been around for a number of years. It's radio waves. Nothing really all that interesting about it. No different than wireless broadcast internet. It's just radio waves. It's frequencies. And yet, being able to use it to actually communicate is an innovation that everyone is fighting to get in on. If you're a company doing communications, you're fighting to get on the ground because this could be highly valuable, could make you a fortune. And because it's in the imagination, you might have heard of Marconi and Nikola Tesla, who have very famous disagreements about who invented what. But Tesla went so far as to argue and to build a prototype on Long Island of a tower that looked very similar to the DeForest Tower, that it could broadcast messages, but also power. That electrical power, what we would do today, we call PPOE, when it comes to internet infrastructure, the ability to send electricity to any point, to anyone with the receiver. And because, I don't know if everyone noticed, Nikola Tesla was not good at business. To Edison will tell you that. His interest was to give that all away. And that probably didn't help him, actually keep his patents and develop this into a workable technology. My point is, coming into the fair, there's a lot of imagination, a lot of interest in wireless, and yet some really important technologic milestones had not happened yet, and they do at the fair. And DeForest is the center of that. And not only does it demonstrate it across the World's Fair campus, but it is land distance records happen here. So the furthest broadcast and reception, so send a message, receive a message in wireless, is actually to Chicago, 300 miles. And the receiving sending station in Chicago is in downtown, where engineers and scientists everywhere said there's no way you can get a radio signal into the concrete and steel corridor that is downtown Chicago. And it worked, 300 miles. That was a record, and it earned, because the fair gave awards to everyone, that happened to win DeForest the wireless innovator of the fair award. But for people on the ground, the hard thing about wireless is that it's really difficult to teach them how it works. And if the fair is about pedagogy, then, as Halstead says, showing things how they work without necessarily all the finish is pretty important. So I'm going to back up, everyone, to look back at that tower. This tower, fun fact, was not built here. It was actually built and used in Niagara Falls, and it was taken apart and shipped by rail, and rail brought it right into the fairground and built on site and reassembled. It's completely without finish, right? It's just very basic tower, the kinds that you will see in a number of features of this era. It's all about infrastructure. And this had so much electricity passing through it that as messages are sent and received still in Morse code, telegraphic code, that as people approach, by many accounts, at least a football stadium away, they could hear the pop and crackle of the electricity moving up to the tower for its broadcast. That is to say, this wireless, while you couldn't see the messages, you could hear its infrastructure, and it was a full sensory experience. Here, these towers here provide reception as well as transmission from inside the Palace of Electricity, which has a number of amazing artifacts there to not just amuse and surprise visitors, but also as a way of, hey, we sell typewriters, come buy some. We sell automobiles, buy some. Same thing with DeForest. This is a marketing moment, an important one to expand business. And interestingly, one of the ways it did that is it used the DeForest Tower to broadcast journalistic shorts from the fairground to the Post-Dispatch and a few other newspapers. And it worked really well. And by some accounts, like 5,000 words a day were sent and received and were later published same day to kind of sell it on its efficiency. People on the ground would come to the sending and receiving station in the Palace of Electricity, and they would write a message to themselves. And then they would go elsewhere, either in the building or elsewhere on the fairgrounds, to these mobile stations, and they would receive the same message. It would print back out. This actually prints automatically. The coded Morse code comes out printed by machine. And this is this tactile experience of holding a wireless message is selling people on the important idea that this is the innovation to come. The world coming forward is going to be marked not by cords, but by cord cutting. What's efficient is stepping into wireless domain, the sort of thing we hope for today. If you look up here, there's 10,000 wires, right? To live without those is a really handy efficiency. I want to note real quick that this automobile cart, as they called it, has a predecessor already in practice in the continent, in Europe. These are battlefield communication devices. So we're already using wireless communications to keep military leaders in touch with forces within a particular geographic range. And that is to say, that wasn't the innovation of the fair. One of the other elements that people really enjoyed, so they loved going to, by all accounts from the memoirs and the number of newspapers that wrote about wireless technology and the main DeForest Tower, people really got a kick out of visiting this particular station, this particular exhibit that doesn't look like anything else at the fair. That's just a painted sign of a building. This is the long-range transmitter. This is the one that's used to set milestones in terms of distance, being able to contact Illinois, various distance there, all the way up into Chicago. And it was located, if you look at the right-hand side of this graphic, where you have the fine arts is in sort of the Palace of Fine Arts there. The Art Museum is sort of center up, top center. Just to the right of that, you'll see wireless telegraphy. This too, this is the only map I've ever found it actually anchoring its exact location. And this one is actually right. But it's nestled inside the Beaux-Arts of these various buildings. But it itself is fairly ugly, but it was huge. It was spectacular for its size. This is a couple hundred feet in the air, and the circumference, I don't know if you can see, there are wires that move at angles from the post. Those are not providing electricity. Those are just the stability wires, and they're massive. And so the circumference around this that they have to fence people from coming in contact with, these are anchored to, generally speaking, grounding copper plates under the ground. this was a massive installation and speaks to that moment, that sense of excitement and innovation about what the future is going to look like. And lo and behold, it can be built right now. And to go ugly instead of aesthetic affords visitors an opportunity to see, to some extent, how this actually works. Here's another view of the Palace of Electricity, of an attendant working the telegraph station. The folks here, not in the broadcast tower, but here down in the palace, had two jobs. Entertain people by sending these little messages to themselves elsewhere, and then to stand there and explain exactly what's happening. That they're using telegraphic devices to send and receive, the ... devices, but their job is to explain how electricity is being sent to the roof, and this message is being sent out over airwaves. And there, according to many accounts, there's lots of impressed people who would just gather around when the demonstration moments would take place. This is, wow, this did not render well, but anyways, this is an excerpt from, I believe this is the Electrical Review, that talks about the telegraphy installation in the Palace of Electricity, and says that the public there is a great to the public, there is a great deal of mystery about communication without wires or other connection. By actually hearing the messages sent and received, the uncanny impression disappears, and the commercial possibilities become more apparent to all. This is a terrific moment to set technologic records, as well as to tether technological innovation to capital to be able to set your business. Okay, who's bored now? Anyone want boredom points? I give them away a lot in class. And if you could ask anyone online if there's any hands for some boredom points, I'll be happy to. It's tethered to Bitcoin somewhere, somehow. All right, so my essay is mostly about wireless. There's more I can get into there. But what I want to do next is I want to take this idea of teaching and of the scientific citizen, and I want to take you to another exhibit that I call the Great Furnace. And that is the periheliophore, which it goes by a number of different names. But this was an installation from Portugal. This is, you probably know this already, that's M.A. Gomes, the Portuguese Catholic priest, who, by the way, the Catholic enthusiasts in Portugal still write about him to this day, develops this particular technology, and it is over on the western side of the fair to the south of Fish and Game, and it's in between the restaurants and the distillery. It's kind of nestled in between, and it is facing due south. And I'm going to go off camera for half a second. I want to highlight that we have the infrastructure here. This is the main support. This device here is an automatic adjuster. As the sun moves in the sky from its high point setting to low, it would automatically adjust the mirror array to do what the mirror array is supposed to do. And here's the funny thing, no one understood what it was supposed to do. But apparently it was really good at killing birds. I have found a number of different, I don't know if these are urban legend, I'm a little skeptical, but that apparently birds stepping in the pathway of the solar collection, which is the mirror, to the focal point, which is over by where the men are standing, just to the left of the men on the right, that to step in between there at several thousand degrees instantly poofed them into feathers and dust. In this object, as weird as it was, that no one really understood, it was in between two train stations, so between 6 and 7, as you pass through WashU campus and the physical culture of the Olympic side, and then come back towards the agricultural building. This is in between, and it got a lot of notice from visitors. Easy to walk to. You have an alcohol station right behind it, so why not? But reporters loved talking about this. And that's the LA Times. This is New York Times, I believe. So coast to coast and even international journalism focuses on the wonder that is this particular machine. And I'm going to read for you some stuff I've written about this. So to bore you, all English language accounts of the inventor and his machine cater to a public appetite for stories about unorthodox inventors and their unorthodox machines that together might spur the next significant and profitable technology. That is, this device is a proof of concept. It does nothing except possibly blow up birds, but it does nothing practical. And yet, its audacity draws the attention of many. Evidence of American interest in inventors and big tech sprawled across pop culture at this time, somewhat similar in scale and legibility today. Henry Ford was obviously a known public figure, not quite dominant just yet, but Thomas Edison was. So too, Nikola Tesla, the rival, and newspapers and magazines were loaded with names of ingenious and clever minds claiming to have the next major innovation near to hand. These stories almost always sought to connect the importance of the idea to its viability for profit, because the one story the public loved more than the plucky inventor genius was the powerful genius of business. So it was that Father Gomes, a Jesuit priest from Portugal, became the newest face of an American cultural phenomenon. If you look at any of the popular tech magazines, Popular Mechanics, Scientific American, you're going to find quite the devotion to finding the next genius out of their garage coming with the next great thing. In the November 20th, 1904 edition of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, this breathy headline declares that Edison, of all people, was beaten by a Portuguese priest in a race to find the so-called supreme degree, that is the upper range of heat, the opposite of Kelvin's lowest, blah, blah, blah. The point here is that the sensationalism of the inventor coming up with something bizarrely new is even pushing this legacy giant figure in communication technology and in general commercial technology aside for something that can't be used anywhere else. It's not, can't go anywhere, can't be used usefully. Gomes was interested, he's kind of is Good Will Hunting a useful reference culturally as a movie? Gomes is that way. I've worked deeply to figure out who this person is and follow his career. And so he comes out of nowhere. He's an engineering genius. He's brilliant with mathematics, and no one saw him coming because he doesn't have common educational pedigree. So the Americans loved him because it's the story of out of nowhere guy making this next amazing thing that the hope is, as a proof of concept, this device is the next wave of industrial production. It's about the creation of energy, of locating and securing solar energy to a focal point. If you look to our gentlemen who are sitting to the bottom center of the screen, one is up on the support system, the one is next to actually the focal point. That is the collection basket, a small asbestos-laden bucket into which they put various substances for tests to see how hot they could get the focal point, but also to amaze people when they melted things up to and including some soft metals, not quite iron.
Curious why he didn't hook up water pump, run water past. There was water pumps all through the park.
That's a great
There's no
question.
reason why he couldn't have heated buildings.
Correct.
Water for people to take a spa bath
Mhm.
off to the side or something.
Absolutely. And part of that is actually the long history of these devices. So today, real quick, one of my favorite things I like to teach students is how there are two amazing conspiracy theories, if you want to call them that, just theories of the past that are still quite active. One is that the World's Fair never happened. And the Eiffel Tower was never built for one reason, because no one knew how to build anything taller than 2 stories. Everything you see, all that photographic evidence is fake. And go on YouTube. It's amazing the stories that people will spend an hour and a half on iMovie to give you about that. And the second one is that this wasn't about creating industrial energy, but was operating in a 2,000-year-long history of directed energy weapons. That this is a secret military project like all of the solar collectors that came before them. The earliest that I have found of these interests to localize sunlight go back about 38 years. And so no one had thought about using and advancing water pump the way that you're describing, because these inventors, none of whom are capitalists, none of whom are industrialists, they're not interested in the practical application, how to build that out. They want to leave that for others. And Gomes, in many of his interviews, says exactly that. I'm just here to show you it could be done and that it could be applied. And importantly, he wanted to give it away for free so that it would also use free energy to expand industrial capitalism. He was interested, but he knew that's not his particular specialty. The Fair's guidebook titled this machine the solar engine, and various press accounts used that or another phrase, the solar furnace, to signal that what the Greek word, the pieces of it, periheliophore, meant, and neither is an exact definition, but both fit, and this is the important part, the expectations of audiences. That energy, whatever its form, powers industrial manufacturing, that the energies of nature, whether water, sun, wind, or fossil fuels, ought to serve the expansion of industry, the success of which brings new wealth, prosperity, and convenience, consumer convenience. Gomes understood himself as a scientist, not an industrialist, but he did think his machine was the hoped-for answer to a long-burning industrial drama. By making visible the real forces of nature, he said, it would be easy to capture them and put them to the service of man, science, and industry. Yes.
In your research, did you ever find out what happened to this device after the fair?
That's a great question. More is cataloged in terms of how it got here, how it was shipped precariously overseas, piece by piece, and how many of these reflective panels were destroyed and they had to redesign them on the fly. I've heard a number of counts, and I cannot yet verify. The one that is most often repeated in, so what's our anniversary year this year from the fair?
121 years.
121 years. This has been talked about for 120 of those years. It keeps reappearing in specialist literature, particularly in Portugal and in Europe. And the common story is that it was disassembled and shipped back. But the problem is it's the same story that's repeated. None of it is really showing particular primary evidence that that's exactly what happened. He stays a remarkable public figure for a few more years until the field moves past him. And today in engineering schools, solar energy as part of the kind of complex of renewable energy technologies keeps coming back to this as the most important benchmark for what the 20th century would try to do, even though it doesn't become a particularly widely adopted technology. The energy pyramid in Dubai, that's about to be shut down. That's the closest, probably fanciest version, the most technologically advanced version of this. That was in use for almost at least 10, 12 years, but they're shutting it down for a number of reasons. But no, I can't answer that specifically. I have too many rumors and not enough fact at this point. Okay. But I want to highlight too, it did nothing, but it showed everything. And people showed up to maybe see birds be poofed, but more importantly, to see things melt. That someone could use machinery of such scale to actually develop something that could possibly harness the sun for greater interests. All right, I'm going to go from that boring one to my favorite, the spirit of the 20th century. Here's Halstead again, further along in his book. Nothing is so universally attractive as power, the admiration for might, and the desire to see it in evidence, that is, material objects, to feel it and sense it, to remember it and to tell it. And the remembering and the telling, he says, are instinctive. This is a part of how men, women, and children operate. They see the amazing thing, it's right in front of them, and they want to remember it and they want to share it. It's part of this pedagogical paradigm I'm suggesting is the throughput. It's the line of thought that really connects everything across the fairgrounds. And here is, you probably know this is the Palace of Transportation, one of the more widely circulated photographs from Mohist that everyone else on the internet claims that they found for themselves, but they just steal it from Mohist, I believe. And anyways, this is the spirit of the century. This was at the very center of the Palace of Transportation, and sits inside or next to a museum. So I'm going to read a little bit of this that I've written about before about this particular display. Herbert Walker, writing in the October edition of Scientific American, argued that the most important exhibit was a remarkable collection of old locomotives that provided the public a history of locomotive engineering long missing from books. This material history features machines or reproductions dating to the 17th century from both Britain and America, preludes to the locomotive age that showcased important moments of innovation and experimentation. Here's the photographs he had taken and how they composited them into the magazine. He focuses on how each machine was the first at something, whether the first experiment harnessing steam for locomotion, or the first engine to run in Chicago, or the first with a particular innovation, or even the first engine in New York to pull passenger cars, which leaned heavily for its style and aesthetics directly from horse-drawn carriages. Walker ends with a quick catalog of the modern machines, one whose height and weight and hauling power dwarf any of the predecessors, and his textual tour follows a historical narrative that organizes machines into, and this is important, a coherent story of engineering prowess. Principally, how iterative changes over time yield fruits of a prosperous industry and with it a nation. Such histories need an origin machine, one that consolidates all experimentation in steam into the awkward, probably unworkable, but brilliantly foresighted model of genius. And that is, for this display in the upper left-hand corner, that belly furnace with a smokestack and four wheels, that tiny one, that's Isaac Newton had designed that. And this is a reproduction of that original. The idea that you could actually harness something explosive like steam and make productive work out of it. The machines that come next follow a 200-year history, each an example of important refinements in engineering and steel casting that improve power, handling, durability. The story ends with the newest machines, the behemoths, casting the machines of history into quaint, pre-modern order. Change in scale and power capacity become benchmark timelines for engineering and manufacturing process, and in turn, the machine bodies become proxies for the sophisticated intellectual and metallurgical skills necessary for creating them, possible only in civilizations that have matured into modern, rational, scientific societies. And so the equation is set. Mechanical history becomes a history of applied skill in harnessing power, which in turn becomes the economic and political history of civilizations and empires. And it all begins with this sense of the museum, of teaching people how we get to the spirit of the 20th century in the center by this that's adjacent to it, to the edge of the display. Walker rightly reads that the railway exhibit provided a powerful educational experience. It was like the building itself, tactile, visual, oversized, full of the obdurate massness of machines and history, and the objects were introduced as the most important contributions to that history, connecting engineering and mechanical process in this moment, mostly American, to an originating Enlightenment genius, that is, Newton. All the wealth and comfort and power that comes from that is simply inevitable. This behemoth engine was located in the very center, and it stood atop or was anchored atop a lifted platform of steel, 170 some odd or close to 170-ton locomotive engine built for the big four rail lines. And so if you can see on the engineer's cab, CCC and STL, that's the Cleveland, Chicago, Cincinnati, and St. Louis line that would be used as a locomotive in practice after the World's Fair. Built by the American Locomotive Company, elevated and visible, the guidebook writes, from every area in the palace. And a palace full of machines, automobiles and horse carriages, typewriters, domestic technology, transportation technology. This thing towers over all the rest. It's an arresting visuality. The Spirit turns slowly on its platform in a wide circumference. Its lights were on as a kind of lighthouse, marking with prominence the muscularity of American productive power. The engine was already the second largest machine at the fair by length and weight, and parking it on a turntable served no practical purpose and added nothing to the history of Western tradition. In short, the display was pointless, which is really why I love it. It's indulgent, it's aggrandizing, and yes, almost without utility. But the decadence of this fabrication was, as I say, arresting. And one of the things I want to highlight here, friends online, if you would look just underneath the platform that the train is on, you can see that there's marked by fencing a wide circumference that kept people safe. And underneath it on the floor was actually a mural. And it is the outline of the rail lines on a topographical map. That is, it's advertising that this thing is about to go into production and to be used at the fair, after the fair, for moving people, for moving things. And it was serving mostly for the company a giant commercial. An unnamed Scientific American correspondent wrote that the locomotive moving majestically around on its axis had a decidedly striking effect. Likewise, the guidebook reports that the sweeping turn of the display served as a strike to the eyes of visitors. An electrical motor powered the lift, and another powered the engine's driving wheels to spin in place. That is, they pantomimed the kinetic energy of the locomotive through an electric motor. So the headlights at the front of the engine were always on. And then the main power bus wheels would do their rotation and the piston arms would move, but it wasn't actually using steam. It was energy, it was electrical energy that was piped up from the bottom of the turntable into the cab itself. Vaulted some 10 feet in the air, it was a relatively quiet mechanical display for a locomotive, very quiet, that powered up production engines for regularly scheduled demonstrations. There's another display on the other side of this where they would turn on major, the steam engines of large locomotives. The brass railings circled the display, keeping visitors from getting too close. And afforded visitors the ability to see the advertisement below and also on the sides of the train itself.
You know how they lifted it up there?
That is still under heavy debate because even the company itself, as far as I can find, has never recorded.
Could you repeat that?
Oh, right, sorry. How did they get it on the lift? That's a great question. No, they had to deliver it. It did not come in pieces. That much I can tell you. Yeah, Mike.
I believe in transportation and also in machinery, which had huge, very heavy generators, turbines and stuff like that. Up in the roof on that very strong trusses up there were lifts.
Yes.
And they could more or less grab a hold of whatever they wanted to lift, an engine, a generator, etc., and lift it up and move it.
Yes.
And drop it on a set of tracks.
Right. So to that point, thank you, Mike. Railroad tracks, there were service railroad tracks that came into this building so that, heavy machinery could be delivered by rail. because there would be no other way to haul these heavy things into that space. And you do have trusses that would lift cars off of railroad, delivery vehicles. This thing is a problem because the turntable is built up out of the ground initially. And the locomotive itself should be out of spec in terms of weight distribution than that assembly in the roof, as far as I can tell. But that's the only way to do it, is to lift it. But for some reason, maybe the company just enjoyed letting people come up with their own ideas and rumors, which I wouldn't blame them, because that's actually, you know, quite effective.
They could have rolled it in on the back of another train and then rolled it off of that onto the.
Yeah. And that's probably my best guess. And it's going to remain that way until I can dive
Sounds good.
deeper.
I'm writing it down.
Okay, good. And you can
It's a
quote me.
rumor that's going straight to the internet, right?
That's right. And you tell them I said so. And maybe that'll get someone who's, you know, taking care of the archive of this company to contact me and say I'm a fool. That would be fine. But again, sorry, say that again.
Or somebody that actually knows will argue with the real story.
Right. And that would be fantastic. That's why, you know, as a complete aside, the importance of talking to people who don't do my job is so important, because there is, to my point earlier, that imagination. All of you are members, right? And so you have a collective experience of what happened. You've heard these stories, you've looked things up for yourself, you've worked in whatever particular cultures of souvenirs. Your giveaway, by the way, sounds pretty fantastic as an object to share out. And so the kind of consolidating what actually happened at the fair is a group effort. No one person, no one historian can do it. Certainly no one professional in my business has done it yet. And no one talks about this. What's interesting, if I may say, people who come to the fair and see this, they've seen railroads before, they've seen engines, they've never seen one this clean and this quiet. But the thing that they mostly haven't seen is the turntable technology. That's the thing that sets this apart from every other element of the locomotive display. That turntable, aside from it being hydraulically lifted, is actual working technology in railroad yards and roundhouses and depots. And is the way that an engine comes in and gets spun from one track to another to change its direction or to come back the way it came in. This is the gaudiest, most useless way to represent that. They didn't have to lift it off the ground. There's something spectacular and what I think at least really amazing marketing technique that was not easy to build. And as every account I have looked at, none of them report that this ever broke down. Unlike lots of other things in this palace and the Palace of Electricity, things break, that's what machines do. This was never offline. And whatever work they had to do, they did overnight to keep it lubricated, to check the electrical connections, to make sure there's no shorts, because it's a giant steel thing and it would want to short. It would be easy to kind of short out the electrical supply. But it is, the most amazing part isn't the engine, it's the turntable. It allows people who aren't railroad enthusiasts, who don't go and kind of gawk tourist-like as to how these depots and roundhouses work. It's very available for you to see. And it's important because this is actually a story about infrastructure. I want to come back to this picture from earlier. Earlier, I wanted to highlight the lower center area, that it was the school that's the most important thing. I'm going to, and for our purposes, thinking about the long history of the importance of schooling, it actually sits adjacent to a powerful technology, the locomotive. Remember, this is the 1860s, so locomotives are common, especially on the east, but clearly we're heading west. We have settlers moving into the deep west, this foggy sort of aspirational space out there. But what's important, the engine's important, but I want you to notice what actually lasts far longer than the engines. And that is from the now, which is the bottom of the screen, to the future, which is the top of the screen. It's railroad tracks and it's telegraph lines. Infrastructure, that's what terraforms a space. does more. These gentlemen on the lower left, they are clear cutting the land to be able to build. It's a weird place to farm, but there are other pictures that suggest that that's what's happening. But it's about the infrastructure. That's what tells you you have won something against nature. You've probably seen this picture. It's utterly overused nowadays. And the story behind how this picture even becomes known in the 20th century, because no one knew it in the 19th century, is a fascinating one. And it's a badly done illustration as opposed to the Currier and Ives piece. But here too, the important thing for our conversation is east is that way to the right. The west is obviously to the left. This is in some circles called manifest destiny. It's more complicated than that. But notice that what's coming from the east is the muse. This is a muse of knowledge, of innovation. She's holding a common school book, that is public school reader, where you would learn to read, write, spell, do arithmetic, that sort of thing. She's holding that. The muse is also holding a wire of information. So this is all about the broadcast of knowledge, and it comes from the East Coast and it moves through the Midwest to the West. And the only object that's going to survive this change of time is the infrastructure of communication and transportation. It's the tracks. It is the telegraph lines itself. And so while the engine, the spirit of the 20th century, represents the culmination of American industrial and economic might at the start of the century, the elevated visibility of infrastructure represents the permanence of sophistication. Walker noted this in his article, pointing out that all the machines in the history of locomotion they stood out upon either the original or an exact replica of the track of their period. It wasn't just the engines that were on display, but it was vital that the whole thing be seen in its infrastructure too. For him, that made the exhibit more authentic. As much as the locomotive was a powerful symbol of tech advancement, the truly legible material that marked this power belonged to infrastructure. And that infrastructure is the full tally of how one wins the world, even if that means winning it against other cultures. And I could go on for at least another hour, Mike, but I know you would rather I stop. I'm sure everyone else would too. Last thing here, this is also in the essay. This is a ridiculous, stupid, poorly done illustration. It appears 6 years after the World's Fair. And as someone who works in the imagination, how do people think about their past, which is everything I just shared with you, to think about their present, which is about how St. Louis, the nation, the West, win the world. They win this modern 20th century. Here in 1910, out of a Christmas magazine that no longer exists, and myself and the archivist at Mohist have yet to find the original, the edition that this came out of. We just knew of this picture. This is imagining St. Louis in 2010. And some things to highlight, besides the strange tower in the background, but that mostly would take up all of Clayton and U City if we understand it by scale. This is Olive looking west. And there's a long tradition of photographic imagery that is advertising St. Louis that's about standing from the east and looking west down this particular corridor. And so this illustration is tapping into it. But importantly, it's tapping into the features of the World's Fair. Starting with that tower in the background, that is a futuristic version of the De Graaf wireless. All the street politics down below, St. Louis streets suddenly have no potholes. They're wide. There's pedestrians, but you don't have bicycles and you don't have vehicles. You have public transportation on the ground level. Over here on the left, along these enormously oversized and unrealistic superstructures, are dirigible Ubers. You can get small class rides to your apartment level right there. All of this is organized rationally and without wires. There is no infrastructure to be seen. And that tower in the back, which is a kind of airport, is also a broadcast station for organizing all of this. and also here at the waterfront, because the Mississippi never floods, so you're going to bring your fairlight gondolas straight to the banks. But even the colonnades and the callbacks to kind of Roman features of empire speak to some of the elements of the fair. And if this was the only time we saw this image, it wouldn't be interesting. Except this image gets hijacked and reprinted by at least 5 cities I found so far within a few years of this date, where they scrub out where it says St. Louis, Missouri, put in name of the city from Georgia, city from Troy, New York. If you've ever been upstate, Troy doesn't look anything like this. But that idea that this sets the imagination to the future is what's really compelling. And I think, and feel free to disagree with me, everyone, I think that actually makes the fair even more important object to study carefully and to know, because it anchors us in a sense of identity in the past and tries to set a very clean and orderly St. Louis. Sure, that apparently has geoengineered the Mississippi to never be a problem, but all the same, it's trying to set that the 20th century is about tech to control nature, and St. Louis is as awesome and will be in the future as people in the World's Fair organizing it were hoping to make it. And I'm going to stop boring everyone here. I'm going to turn things back to Mike, and I want to thank everyone for listening. You get boredom points, everyone. Yay! Everyone gets boredom points. The 20th, so we do know that it was put into production and lasted, I believe, about 30 years, running the 4-line conglomerate company that ran to Cincinnati and now I'm going to forget them. Cincinnati, Cleveland,
Chicago.
thank you, and Chicago. And by the way, Chicago, who's ever heard of that town, right? Go St. Louis. That was it. And I'm a transplant to this town. And I showed up here when y'all won a Super Bowl, and I've never left. So, you know, better than Chicago by many measures.
And you said that someone can type something up in the palace, and then if they go to the vehicles, would all the vehicles have everybody's message? How would you find your message?
Great set of questions. And for those online, yep. The question is, what's your name, by the way?
Holly.
Holly. Holly was asking about the wireless automobile carts that received messages, and how did people know what their message was from all the stuff that would be printed there. So I can tell you that we know of 5 of these. I suspect that there were more, because everything I found so far, it was really a fun experience, and they would change where they were every day. Just like a lot of sort of the street side culture around food and beverages would move their location, parades, these did too. That way it was always surprising to people. And as far as I know, they didn't even charge money for this sort of attraction. Everything else cost money, this didn't. And so you would have an operator, an employee, who this has a set of electrical batteries underneath the printing box. And that employee would drive it out to a particular location, stay there for a few hours. So there's always someone there to make sure it still worked, because these things break a lot. But it would also be the one who would sort what messages were coming through. So when you signed up to send yourself a message or send it to someone else, it has to be just like in sort of the common culture of using telegraphs. Your telegraph, it has to be a to and a from, and then a limited message. And so people would show up and get it, and they would be utterly amazed, or they were encouraged to go to the closest one possible to see how fast it got there, as a way of promoting that this is a solid technology, it works, be amazed, tell people to buy it.
I've also seen 2 photos, I don't know if it's St. Louis Public Library or Missouri History Museum, individual gentlemen walking around with what looked like what we call the bag phone.
Yep.
Headphones and that. As far as the same network or
Absolutely. What's your name?
Garrett.
Garrett was just saying that he has noticed in at least 2 photographs, and there's actually many more of them. I'm surprised Mohis doesn't have them by now. But anyways, of this device that someone would wear off of their shoulders around their neck, with headphones, and this weird circle thing would be the receiver, and they would be able to hear. And there's at least one model where you supposedly could speak into it and it would be picked up nearby. And part of what that could do is it picks up some of the radio waves so you can hear the dot dashes of messages. And people who know Morse would be able to know what people were sending to each other, because they didn't have encryption back then, which is another thing that I teach. But thank you. Yeah.
I've read at least one description, I've read at least one description of that talked about it was actually receiving in that circular hoop light signals that were somehow modulating the clicks and dots and dashes, and that's what he was hearing, transmitted by light.
Yeah. Also, I think that's a wee bit of embellishment there. Because again, that's a novelty technology for people just to have some fun with.